Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I continue with the next video in the ongoing series about Officer Lee, a story that is still slowly unfolding, with connections that seem scattered at first, yet are quietly linking together in ways no one could have anticipated. That day, Officer Lee and Diep were assigned to patrol a border-adjacent area. This region had long been considered sensitive, especially in recent times, as cases of smuggling, illegal transportation, and covert illicit transactions had been occurring more frequently, and with increasing sophistication. Although both Lee and Diep were accustomed to the constant tension of their work, they could clearly sense that something about that day felt unusually different. It was already late afternoon. The fading sunlight washed the long road in a pale yellow mixed with a cold gray hue. The border road, normally quiet, now felt eerily deserted. No passing vehicles. No pedestrians. Only gusts of wind slipping through the wild grass along the roadside, carrying a creeping chill. Each step of their patrol echoed dryly, as if swallowed by the vast emptiness around them. Lee walked ahead, his eyes scanning both sides of the road without pause. Years of experience had trained him to stay alert to even the smallest detail. And it was in what seemed like an ordinary moment that he noticed a shape lying motionless ahead. At first, it was only a faint shadow against the darkened ground, but the closer he got, the faster his heart began to race. "Diep, stop," Lee said, his voice low but firm. He immediately rushed forward. Before him lay a woman on her side at the edge of the road. Her clothes were disheveled, covered in dust and darkened bloodstains. Her hair was tangled, nearly concealing her face, but even at a glance, Lee could tell her condition was critical. He knelt down and checked her breathing. It was extremely weak, uneven, as though a moment's delay would push everything beyond control. Lee gently brushed the woman's hair aside, and in that instant, he froze. It was Diep. The woman who was often seen beside CEO James, composed, reserved, yet carrying a quiet, distinctive presence. The image Lee had of Diep in his memory stood in stark contrast to the unconscious figure before him now. Her face was pale, her lips dry, untreated wounds bleeding through her clothes. There was no time to think further. Lee made a swift decision. With the area being far from the city center, taking Diep directly to a hospital was not the safest immediate option. He and Diep lifted her into the vehicle and headed to Lee's home, the closest place where they could administer first aid and prevent her condition from worsening. On the way, Lee kept watching Diep through the rearview mirror. Her face remained motionless, but her breathing was still there, fragile, like a single thread. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Questions flooded his mind, but he pushed them all aside. At that moment, there was only one thing that mattered: keeping Diep alive. Once they reached his house, Lee moved quickly. He arranged everything and called a trusted doctor, someone who had assisted him in emergency situations before. When the doctor arrived, Diep's wounds were carefully treated, fluids were administered, and she was placed in a secure position. The house, usually quiet, now felt heavy with the scent of antiseptic and an unspoken tension. Lee stood in one corner of the room, watching every movement the doctor made. He said very little, but his eyes never left Diep. Each shallow breath she took made him unconsciously hold his own. He was a police officer, he had seen countless critical cases, but this time felt different. This was more than professional responsibility. When the immediate treatment was complete, the doctor instructed that she needed close monitoring. Lee nodded, committing every word to memory. The room grew quieter, filled only with the steady drip of the four. Diep had not yet regained consciousness. Her face looked calmer now, but the fragility remained unmistakable. Lee sat down on a nearby chair. In that rare moment of stillness, a sense of unease crept into his chest. It wasn't just concern for her injuries, it was a vague intuition, as though Diep's appearance in his life, in this exact situation, was no coincidence. Everything seemed to be guiding him toward something he could not yet clearly see. The light in the room cast soft shadows across Diep's face, making her features feel both familiar and distant. Lee watched her in silence, his mind filled with questions that had no answers yet. And in that quiet moment, the story seemed to continue unfolding, waiting for the next pieces to be revealed. When Diep began to show signs of waking up, the room was still bathed in a soft yellow light, the silence so deep that every breath could be heard clearly. Her eyelashes fluttered slightly, and her breathing was no longer as broken as before, gradually becoming steadier. Lee was the first to notice. He stood up at once, moved closer, and softly called her name, his voice low and slow, as if afraid that even a slightly louder sound might shatter that fragile moment. Diep opened her eyes very slowly. At first, her gaze was unfocused and hazy, as though she could not yet tell where reality ended and the remnants of panic began. It took a few seconds for her eyes to regain clarity, drifting across the unfamiliar ceiling before finally settling on Lee's face. Confusion was evident in her eyes, accompanied by a trace of unease she had not yet managed to hide. Lee quickly reassured her, telling her she was safe, that everything was all right. He did not press her with questions, nor did he rush her to recall what had happened. As soon as he was sure she was conscious, Lee took out his phone and stepped aside to another corner of the room to contact CEO James. He understood clearly that the person who needed to be there now was not just there out of responsibility, but because of Diep. As soon as the call connected, Lee barely had time to finish his sentence before James's voice came through the line, urgent and tense. When Lee confirmed that Diep was alive and out of immediate danger, James seemed to freeze for a few seconds. The panic he had been suppressing since the call finally broke through in his ragged breathing and unsteady voice. He said only that he was coming right away, then hung up. The waiting that followed felt unbearably slow. Diep lay quietly on the bed, her eyes moving faintly from time to time, though it was clear she was still very weak. Lee stayed nearby, not leaving, silently watching even the smallest changes. He noticed that Diep's hand would occasionally tighten reflexively, as if the memories of what she had just endured were still clinging to her, refusing to let go. When James appeared at the doorway, the calm composure he usually carried was almost gone. His coat was still on, his steps hurried, his eyes fixed solely on the figure lying on the bed. The moment he saw that Diep was still breathing, still able to look at him, James stopped short, as if all the strength had suddenly drained from his body. It took him a few seconds before he moved closer and called her name, his voice hoarse with tension. Diep turned her head at the sound of James's voice. When her eyes met his, a brief sense of relief flickered through them, quickly followed by visible exhaustion. James took her hand, his grip trembling slightly, as if to reassure himself that the person before him was real, not just a fear that had haunted him the entire drive over. Once Diep seemed more stable, James turned to Lee. He bowed his head deeply, thanking him again and again, his voice serious and sincere. There was no formality, no polite small talk, only the gratitude of a man who had just gotten back the most important thing in his life by the narrowest margin. Lee responded briefly, saying it was simply his duty, though his eyes showed that he fully understood how serious the situation had been. After everyone had calmed down a little, Diep and James began to recount what had happened. Diep's voice was still weak, and she had to pause now and then to catch her breath. James sat beside her, occasionally filling in details she was too exhausted to finish. The story slowly took shape, fragmented, but clear enough for Lee to grasp just how dangerous the situation had been. It turned out that James's enemies had been secretly watching Diep for some time. Rather than confronting James directly, they chose an indirect approach, targeting the person closest to him as a form of revenge. The surveillance had gone on quietly, long enough for Diep to sense that something was wrong. But when she tried to avoid it, everything spiraled beyond control. While attempting to escape, Diep was injured. She could not remember how long she had run, only that the surroundings grew increasingly deserted, the road ahead more desolate and cold. By the time her strength was completely gone and her injuries made it impossible to continue, her vision blurred and then went dark. The last thing she remembered was collapsing onto the cold ground, followed by total darkness. James tightened his grip as he listened. He said that if Lee and Dick had not happened to be patrolling that area that day, the consequences would have been unthinkable. His voice dropped lower, carrying both self-blame and restrained fury. Lee listened without interrupting, but in his mind, he began piecing everything together, from the moment he found Diep to the details she had just revealed. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Each of them carried thoughts they had yet to put into words. Diep lay there, closing her eyes briefly before opening them again, as if trying to steady herself. James remained at her side, not leaving for a second. Lee stepped slightly back, observing the entire scene, a growing sense within him that this incident would not end as a simple attack. Every detail still seemed to be connected, pointing towards something larger, something he had not yet fully uncovered. Everything seemed to stop there. The tension in the room gradually eased once the story had been told. Diep was temporarily out of danger. James stayed by her side without leaving for a second, and Lee stood there in the role of a witness, silent, observant, lost in thought. All of them felt that the most dangerous part had passed, that this was simply a serious incident that had fortunately been stopped in time. Lee stepped closer when he saw Diep trying to sit up. He reached out to support her, careful to avoid her injuries. Diep winced slightly from the pain, and as she moved, the fabric of her shirt shifted aside. It was only a fleeting moment, barely noticeable, noticed by no one except Lee. His gaze dropped instinctively, then froze. On Diep's side, near her waist where the shirt had slipped, a small birthmark was revealed. Whether it was the lighting or the sudden rush of sensation, in that instant Lee felt as if he had been locked in place. All sound around him seemed to disappear. James's voice, the movements in the room, everything faded away, replaced by a single image burning clearly in his mind. That birthmark was far too familiar. Lee could not be mistaken. No matter how many years had passed, no matter how childhood memories might fade with time, this detail did not. It was identical to the birthmark of his younger sister, the sister who had vanished from his life when they were both very young. A birthmark in the exact same place, the same shape, the same size. Something he had remembered with painful clarity for years, like a mark carved into his memory. Lee's heart began to pound harder, so violently that he had to take a deep breath to steady himself. Buried memories suddenly surged back, vivid and merciless. That year, the two siblings had gone out together. It had been an ordinary day, until the accident happened. Lee remembered only fragmented images, chaotic sounds, a sharp pain, then darkness. When he woke up, everything had changed. His sister was gone. No one could explain what had happened. There were no clues, no traces. She had vanished from the world without a sign. From that day on, Lee's life veered onto a different path. The guilt and regret followed him for years, growing heavier as he grew older. He had never stopped searching, even as the few leads he found led only to dead ends, even as hope was worn down to almost nothing. Lee had told himself that perhaps his sister was no longer alive. But deep down, he had never truly accepted that. And now, standing before Diep, that feeling returned in a way he had never prepared for. It wasn't just the birthmark. The longer he looked, the more he noticed another strange familiarity. Diep's eyes when she first woke, confused, yet trying to remain composed, reminded him of something long ago. That expression, the way she pressed her lips together slightly when in pain, even the feeling of standing near her now, everything stirred a sense of closeness that was hard to explain. Lee stood motionless, forcing himself to appear calm. He said nothing and let no emotion show. Only the hand supporting Diep tightened unconsciously for a brief second, then quickly relaxed. He stepped back, as if needing distance to breathe, to untangle the chaos of thoughts racing through his mind. Diep seemed unaware of the change. She simply adjusted her clothing, the pain keeping her focused on herself rather than on the looks around her. James remained at her side, his attention fixed entirely on her, worried, yet relieved that she was awake. Neither of them noticed that the brief moment just now had created a tiny crack in their fragile sense of calm. Lee turned away, his eyes avoiding Diep for a moment. Inside him was a tangled mix of emotions, confusion, suspicion, and a deep stirring he did not dare name. The rational mind of a police officer forced him to be cautious, to remind himself that it could all be coincidence. But his heart refused to settle. It beat hard and fast, as if trying to remind him of something he had been searching for all these years. He stood there, quietly observing Diep once more. That sense of familiarity did not fade. On the contrary, it grew clearer, as if waiting to be touched, to be uncovered. And in that moment, Lee understood that this feeling would not be easily dismissed. Even if he said nothing, even if no one else noticed, that strange connection continued to exist, silently, unmistakably, right before his eyes. From that day on, Lee no longer viewed the incident as merely an accidental rescue. On the surface, everything seemed to return to its normal course. Diep was taken home by James to recover, the incident was kept quiet due to personal security concerns, and Lee continued with his daily duties as if nothing had changed. But only Lee knew that inside him, everything had begun to shift in a completely different direction. The image of that birthmark would not leave his mind. No matter how hard he tried to focus on work, no matter how often he reminded himself to stay rational and cautious, every night the moment Diep's shirt had slipped, revealing that familiar mark, returned with haunting clarity. Lee understood how dangerous this feeling was for someone in his line of work. Personal emotions, if left unchecked, could lead to grave mistakes. Yet he also knew that some things could not simply be ignored. Lee did not tell James. Nor did he let Diep, or anyone else, sense the change in his thoughts. Every step he took afterward was quiet and discreet, true to the way of a police officer accustomed to working in the shadows. He contacted a few trusted subordinates, men who had followed him long enough to know that when Lee asked for something, absolute caution was required. The order was brief and precise: investigate Diep's identity. No noise. No official reports. No trace left in easily tracked systems. Lee demanded everything that could be found: Diep's past, her biological family, personal records from her earliest years, changes of residence, and especially the periods in her life that appeared almost blank. Those stretches of time with no clear data, no witnesses, no concrete traces. The more Lee thought about it, the more he realized how many questions surrounded Diep's life. A woman who appeared beside James with what seemed like a flawless background, yet was missing the most crucial details of her childhood. Broken timelines. Information that existed only on the surface, just enough to seem reasonable, but never enough to feel complete. Lee did not allow himself to jump to conclusions. He knew better than anyone that coincidences existed in this world. Similar birthmarks could be accidental. Familiar facial features could be memory distorted by emotion. But Lee also knew something else just as well: certain instincts do not arise without reason. They are forged from experience, from years of seeing and hearing, from a lifetime spent tracing the path of truth. Each report that came in, piece by piece, filled Lee with both anticipation and caution. He read every line carefully, every detail that might seem insignificant. A former place of residence. A name change. A period with no complete medical records. All of it he stored away, connecting the fragments in his mind. Yet the more information surfaced, the more the answer seemed to remain just out of reach. At times, Lee wondered if he was going too far. Was Diep truly connected to his past, to the younger sister who had vanished all those years ago? Or was this nothing more than a cruel coincidence, a bitter trick of fate, causing him, driven by unresolved guilt, to see a familiar shadow in a woman who was, in truth, a stranger? Those questions had no immediate answers. They hovered in Lee's mind, following him through every shift, every sleepless night. Each time he found himself thinking of Diep, he had to remind himself to keep his distance, to maintain the role of an outsider. Yet deep down, he knew he had already stepped onto a path that would not be easy to turn back from. The truth, if it existed, would not come on its own. It had to be traced, slowly, carefully, through the scattered fragments of the past. And Lee understood clearly that whatever the outcome might be, from the moment that Birthmark was revealed, his life and Diep's had been silently drawn closer together by an invisible thread, one he did not yet dare to name. Was Diep truly the sister Lee had been searching for all these years? Or was it all merely a cruel arrangement of fate, meant to test his faith and his memories? The truth still lay somewhere within the unanswered gaps, waiting for the moment it would finally be revealed.
Xin chào mọi người. Cảm ơn mọi người đã xem hết video hôm nay của mình và lắng nghe câu chuyện mình chia sẻ. Hy vọng mọi người vẫn sẽ yêu thích những câu chuyện của mình về câu chuyện tình yêu tự giam và cảnh sát Ly. Và hiện tại thì những video của mình đang được phát hành vào khung giờ 7 giờ tối. Thì nếu mà mọi người yêu thích những video của mình thì nhớ bấm nút theo dõi, bật chuông thông báo để nhận thông báo khi mình đăng video mới nhất, và ủng hộ kênh cho mình để mình có động lực ra nhiều video hơn, cũng như là mang đến nhiều câu chuyện hay và hấp dẫn hơn cho mọi người cùng lắng nghe. Hy vọng rằng mọi người sẽ để lại cho mình một số nhận xét ở dưới phần bình luận để mình cải thiện những video về sau, và để mình có động lực làm nhiều video hơn cho mọi người cùng xem. Cảm ơn mọi người đã lắng nghe hết một phút chia sẻ của mình. Hẹn gặp lại mọi người ở trong những video tiếp theo nha.